Hello, everyone. Welcome to another live stream on the History Valley podcast. And tonight I'm joined by Dr. Mark Goodacre and Dr. Stephen Boyce. I have the link to Mark Goodacre's YouTube channel tagged in the description below and to the YouTube channel of Stephen Boyce. Dr. Stephen Boyce's YouTube channel tagged in the description below as well. And both channels will be in the description. Will be in the pinned comment, which is below in the description, including the Mark Goodacre's book, which this particular episode is based on Thomas and the Gospels, the case for Thomas's familiarity with the Synoptics. So Mark and Stephen, thank you both for joining me tonight.
It's a great pleasure. Thanks for having us on, Jacob.
Yeah, glad to be back. It's good to see you, Jacob.
And just real quick, I want to do like a brief recap for those that are not very familiar with the Gospel of Thomas, haven't ever heard of it or ever seen prior discussions or haven't read anything on it. What is the Gospel of Thomas and when was it found?
Who's going first?
Go ahead, Dr. Goodacre.
Okay. Well, the Gospel of Thomas is just the most fascinating, probably the ultimate most fascinating lost gospel from antiquity, because effectively what happened is scholars knew for centuries that there was a Gospel of Thomas. The many early church writers talk about it, but it was completely lost. Like at some point, you get to a point several hundred years into the Christian period, and suddenly people are not quoting it anymore, and it seems to have and when we say it's got lost, it doesn't mean someone's like misplaced it. It means people just stopped copying it, right? They just stopped copying it. And then we have this basically two major fantastic discoveries. The first is the end of the 19th century. These two brilliant young Oxford archaeologists, Grenfell and Hunt, dug up a scrap of the Gospel of Thomas. It has the very unromantic name P-Oxy-1, and that was 1896, 1897, and then 4 years later in 1901 they found two more scraps of the Gospel of Thomas, which have the even less romantic names P-Oxy-654 and P-Oxy-655, but they didn't know for certain what they'd found. They knew it was some unknown sayings of Jesus. They wondered, could it have been the Logia of Jesus, which people have speculated had existed? But finally, all doubts were put to rest when in 1945, a complete text of the Gospel of Thomas in Coptic was discovered in Nag Hammadi in Egypt. And this is basically a complete copy. It's in Nag Hammadi Codex 2. And it's very clearly the same thing that Grenfell and Hunt had found fragments of. And it's found alongside things like the Apocryphon of John, the Gospel of Philip, other non-canonical texts. And it's like, oh my goodness, it's the 20th century and we are discovering fresh gospels that we knew existed, but we haven't seen for centuries. Like so that in a nutshell is the sort of process of the discovery, or should we say the rediscovery of this ancient text.
Yeah.
And are there textual differences between the P-Oxyrhynchus fragments of Thomas with the Coptic version?
Yeah, there are. I mean, and it's a difficult one to evaluate. There are pretty substantial differences. I mean, so P-Oxy-655 has an entire passage. It's the passage that some people know from the canonical Gospels about consider the lilies, consider the birds of the air, which is way longer in the Greek version than it is in the Coptic. And then you also get one saying that's displaced, which occurs at saying 30 compare in the Oxyrhynchus fragments, and it's 77 in the Coptic. But otherwise, it's very obviously the same thing. You know, it's definitely, I mean, it's different witnesses to the same basic work. So yes, there are differences, and the differences are fascinating, but they're not so different that anyone says this is a different work.
Yeah, I just chime in a little bit on the Nag Hammadi in 1945. So what was amazing is, as Dr. Goodacre pointed out, there are fragmented sections of these sayings, these logia that are found. Now we have all 114 sayings, and you're able to actually go through each one and look at some of the differences in these others. But it is a fascinating part because when you get into some of these discussions, you start seeing similarities with nuances to the synoptics, which Dr. Goodacre wrote a whole entire book on. I actually make the argument that the writer of the Gospel of Thomas was familiar with even the fourth gospel, possibly even the Gospel of John. We could debate on that. But there's a major turnaround here because the whole Nag Hammadi collection, the Gospel of Truth, Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Philip, these are extraordinary finds because we see references to them, and they're even put in condemnation and talking about this influence of Gnosticism, which is very broad. And I think that we've done a better job in scholarship today talking about Gnosticism because it's too broad of a label. Now there's different sects that are broken down, some that can't even really be named. There's just weird readings out there that are like, well, that's Gnostic. Yeah, but there's different forms of that, whether you're talking about Docetism or you're looking into some of these other Valentinianists and others. Like, it's too broad to put it that way, but there definitely seems to be some influence. And one of the things that I find interesting about these texts, and Dr. Goodacre, I'd love your thoughts on this. Some of the Gospels are more rivalry based in these collections. Like, I have the secret knowledge and I contain it through this text. And then you see the same thing, like the Gospel of Mary, for example. So I find it interesting that the communities that held these, we do see some of these differences. And I wonder how much the communities influence the transmission or translation, whether it was in Greek first and makes it over. So that's some fun discussions as well, Dr. Goodacre. What do you think about that?
Yes. I mean, if you don't mind responding to that, I mean, I just love the way that lots of these early writers use the idea of secrecy, the idea of secret sayings as a way of getting their own kind of authority. Because if you I mean, you've got a problem, frankly, if you turn up with a new Christian work and you say, hey, I mean, who knows, how, the first person that read the Gospel of Thomas out to anyone, did it. But if you say, I've got this new work, the obvious question is, well, hold on, how come we've never heard this before? And the thing is, and the answer is in the text. The answer is because it's the secret stuff. It's the secret stuff. We're going to give you some new secret stuff. And in fact, it's not just secret stuff. This is the secret sayings of the living Jesus that was spoken to Didymus, the twin, Thomas. So, and the thing is, and Thomas isn't unique in this. You mentioned, Dr. Boyce, Gospel of Mary, and did you mention Gospel of Philip as well? Gospel of Truth. Yes. I mean, all of these texts, they're working with this idea of, okay, you've heard the other stuff. We're going to give you some pretty juicy extra. We're going to give you some extra stuff here, and I think that's part of the sort of genius of these. That because otherwise, people have just tossed them out,
Yeah, and it's a fascinating point in Thomas as well, because when he is given these sacred sayings, he can't say what they are, and the other's like, "What did Jesus say to you?" Right? And he said, "Well, if I were to tell you, the rocks would catch fire and soon, and then it would be over. Everybody would die." I mean, it's a disaster story. But we still don't know what was said to Didymus or Thomas. We still don't know. It doesn't record it. He's saying, "I can't tell you. You would kill me, and then the rocks would kill you." And so it's so secret that it's not even given to us in some places as to what was actually said.
And that makes you want to read on. I mean, so for viewers that are not familiar with it, there's this absolutely amazing saying. It's in Thomas 13, where Jesus basically whispers into Thomas's ear, and the reader doesn't get to hear what was said. So even after you've read these secret sayings of the living Jesus, the reader still thinks, but I want to know what Jesus said in Thomas's ear. That's the thing that's so clever about it.
Let me ask you this about saying 13, because it's actually one of my most favorite in the sayings. Because
mine too. I've honestly, you can spend all day thinking, and it's the genius. It's the genius of the Gospel of Thomas that you keep wanting to go, oh my goodness, what is going on here?
Well, let me ask you this. Do you believe that it resembles the question that's given in Matthew and in Mark, who do men say that I am?
100%. Yeah.
What I find interesting about this, I love your feedback, is that two disciples are named as to answering the question wrong. And one of them is Matthew and one of them is Peter.
Yeah.
I find that interesting. And there may be some tie into this to my own perspective, because by the time of the gospel, depending on somebody dating the Gospel of Thomas, it could be that the two major accounts in the canonical Gospels, Matthew and Mark, ask this question: who do men say that I am? Some say you're Elijah, some say you're John the Baptist. But in that synoptic account, only one speaks up in the synoptics, and that's Peter.
Yeah.
It's interesting that Peter gets it wrong in this account. And Matthew, of all people, Matthew doesn't show up in a lot of the other literature. He isn't really, he's not much of a spokesman in the synoptics, much less into later literature.
It's not there.
Paul's legend, Peter's legend, a lot of the other apostles, John, are legend, but not really Matthew. It almost feels like Thomas is taking a pot shot at Matthew and Mark. And the reason I say that is because Mark has been ascribed to possibly Peter's sermons or things like that. It almost feels like it's saying, like, Matthew's account got this wrong. Mark's account got this wrong. I got the real sayings. I'm the one that actually understood who Jesus was. I'm just so curious. What is your thoughts on that?
No, I think it's basically, great question and great reflections. I mean, to me, it's just too good to be true that the two guys that are mentioned are Peter and Matthew. I mean, out of all the disciples you could have chosen, if it was Bartholomew or Thaddeus, I'd go, who knows what's going on here? Right. But it's Peter and Matthew. I mean, and the thing is, you read Mark's gospel, and Mark's gospel is the gospel of basically of Simon Peter's story. He's the first disciple to be mentioned really, really early on. Like, already he's being called, first person named other than Jesus and John the Baptist. And he's the last person mentioned in 16 verse 7. So Mark's gospel is clearly, whatever you think the origins of Mark's gospel are, Mark's gospel was always seen as being in some way Peter's gospel, whether it's the story of Peter or the story by Peter. And then we go to Matthew's gospel. I think Matthew, knows Mark's gospel, but we know that Matthew was hugely popular in the 2nd century. I mean, when you look at, people providing references to Matthew from pretty early on in the early to mid 2nd century, you got papyrus fragments of it. People know about Matthew's gospel. And I think that the Gospel of Thomas is actually playing with people's knowledge of those two Gospels. He doesn't say, I mean, I think that Thomas also knew Luke, but he can't say Luke because there's no Luke. Even the Luke and Gospel itself doesn't claim that it's written by a disciple. So if you're going to play with already established or already popular Gospels, you play with Matthew and Mark. And I do think that's what's going on in Thomas. I think it's doing what a lot of early Christian gospels doing. It's saying, we know that you know these other texts, but I'm going to give you something extra. And that's really, I think, what's going on there in Thomas. Yeah,
and it's interesting, Peter's answer, as opposed to Matthew, which is quite interesting to me, because Peter speaks of him like some say, he says, you are a righteous angel. And then Matthew says, you're like a wise philosopher, right?
Yeah.
Do you find that interesting too, just on the Peter speaking in the words of you're a righteous angel? And it seems like the writer knows that Peter spoke, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God kind of answer. But shifts the wording to you're an angel. So he associates that with Peter. And then the philosopher is associated with Matthew. Is there any uniqueness there?
I think so. And the thing is, you've already got a precedent for this in John's gospel, in that when Peter gets to do his confession in John at the end of John 6, he doesn't say Christ, Son of God. He says, you're the Holy One of God. So that's another gospel. And I put John a little earlier than Thomas, but it's still, I think, a 2nd century gospel. And so they're playing with this idea of what did Peter actually say. The wise philosopher thing is fascinating. I think that purely comes from a surface, well, I don't want to say surface level impression like I'm being disparaging of the Gospel of Thomas, but any ancient that's looking at the Gospel of Matthew, the first thing they're going to think is this is some kind of philosophical tractate, because the guy keeps talking. He goes on, like, you look at the Sermon on the Mount, it's 138 verses, it goes on and on and on. So I think, and wisdom is very key in Matthew's Gospel as well. So I think that's what's cracking off there. But I absolutely think that it's a nod. it's one of those things which you do in text. It's a sort of knowing nod, to people that understand. I do it in my own writing. Occasionally, I'll put a little nod in there that some readers won't get, and it doesn't matter if they don't, because it works on one level. But then there's readers that will go, "Oh, okay, I know what Goodacre's doing there,"
Yeah, that's a good. So if we could back up a saying, Jacob, you got any other questions on that? I don't want to. I could nerd out all
it's fine.
day on the gospel. And so
I do
Go-
have one,
go for it.
and that is, Mark, do you think that the Oxyrhynchus papyri could indicate an older edition of Thomas, considering some of the textual differences, like in the prologue of the Oxyrhynchus version, it lacks Didymus, and that's
Right.
featured in the
Yes.
Coptic version.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And the thing is, what is so fantastic? So a lot of viewers might not realize this because we kind of ran over it really quickly. When we're looking at these 3 Oxyrhynchus fragments of Thomas, they're all different. In other words, we're not looking at, like, say someone like I've got a book here. Say, in 1,000 years, it's got ripped up into different pieces, and some clever person might realize they're 3 bits of the same book. These are 3 pieces of the same work, but not the same text, if that makes sense. And how do we know that? Because one of them's written on a scroll. One of them's written on the back of a land charter, and the other one's a bit of a codex. So in other words, they're not even the same 3 types of materials. So that's quite exciting. That means that in the late 2nd, early 3rd century, we've got 3 different witnesses to the Gospel of Thomas. And then we have the Coptic text, which, dates to the 4th century. It looks like it was a pretty popular work in this period. And to answer your question directly, Jacob, yes, absolutely. I think that Simon Gather-Coles made a very good case that the Gospel of Thomas was composed in Greek, or the earliest versions of it were in Greek. So I think when we look at the Coptic version, I think we're looking at a translation of a Greek witness. And then I think what we've got in Oxyrhynchus is 3 different bits of 3 different Greek witnesses. And yes, there are quite interesting differences. Broadly speaking, you have to be so careful with generalizations, but very broadly speaking, I think I would say that those 3 Greek fragments are, broadly speaking, oh gosh, I have to be careful here. Broadly speaking, I think the text they're witnessing to is earlier than the Coptic, but not everyone believes that. I think that, but not everyone believes that.
Yeah, I would actually agree with that. I personally think that the Gospel of Thomas was not all 114 sayings in its earliest form. I think there was a lot of redactions that were done, and I'm pretty sure others, would go along with that. I'm pretty sure that Patterson and Robinson and others would say the same thing, that it was possibly developmental. In fact, I would say that the most developed form of it is probably what we see in the Nag Hammadi. That is probably its fullest and close to its fullest form. You can actually see the developmentalism even in Gnostic thinking by the end of the Gospel of Thomas, as opposed to the beginning. You can see the developmental, because Gnosticism was like a flowing, it was constantly developing. It never really had a home. That's why I said we look at Gnosticism, we say, well, that's Gnostic. Too broad, because it really does develop, and you can see some of the development even in the 114 sayings from beginning to end.
No, I think that's right. And our field has been plagued by this term Gnostic, which has often been used as a hold-all category to kind of shunt stuff off into, in a way to saying, well, it's not orthodoxy. It's not what we see in the canon. And that's really, really damaging, because what you're effectively doing there is you're defining multiple different divergent works in terms of what they're not. And what they're not is they're not canonical. And actually, at the end, therefore, the term Gnostic frequently doesn't tell you anything, because it's not actually analyzing anything. Having said that, I actually don't mind the term Gnostic. So Gnostic means, well, let's not go with Gnostic. Let's go with the term Gnosis. Gnosis just means knowledge. Does something like the Gospel of Thomas value knowledge? Yes, absolutely. I mean, it thinks that knowing Jesus knowing yourself, these are really important things. So they did valorize gnosis, knowing things. So I'm not unhappy at all about calling the Gospel of Thomas Gnostic, if that's what we mean by it. If what we mean by the term Gnostic is shunting into this big category, everything that's not canonical, then I'm not so happy with it.
Yeah, I say that to people all the time. It's like this thing. Well, I'm Christian. What are you, Baptist, Methodist, Presbyterian, Lutheran, Catholic, Orthodox?
Yeah.
I mean, it's like
Yeah.
the Gnostics also had. We have ascribed that term to them more than they
Right,
had
yeah.
ascribed it.
Yeah.
They usually followed after somebody and just named themselves after the person. Either early forms of it, like Cerinthianism, for example, that developed later into Docetism. And I mean, it really is. But yet from the secrets of knowledge that were given, that's where these texts really speak into the secrecy side of things, and they're really big into the Nag Hammadi collection. So, yeah, 100% agree with that.
And I think early church fathers like Cyril of Jerusalem, they connected or Cyril of Jerusalem in particular connected the authorship of the Gospel of Thomas to Manichaean. And when you look at Manichaean literature, because I know some try to dismiss Manichaean connections with it, but actually there are a lot of interesting parallels between Manichaean thought and the Coptic gospel. They both talk about how the physical self is imprisonment of light, and that we need to be liberated from our physical bodies. I can see how if the Oxyrhynchus fragments are as they obviously are, they're witnesses to an older edition. Even though they're just fragments, I think one can make an argument that it's progressively becoming more Gnostic, if you want to call it that, or I would say more Manichaean in flavor.
Well, it's a tough one with Thomas because it's one of those things where you just want to know more about its history. I mean, there's a group of so-called Gnostics called the Narcenes who seem to think that Thomas was all that. That was their, that was one of their go-to texts. But the problem is we don't know as much as we would like to know about the Narcenes. And I mean, Origen himself quotes the Gospel of Thomas on a couple of occasions, one time seemingly negatively and one time quite positively. So it's it's very frustrating when you're doing this isn't just about Christianity. This is about kind of any ancient history. Your textual witness is always limited. So you actually have to sort of guess or use your historical imagination a lot of the time.
Do you think that the church fathers, like the earlier church fathers at pre-Cyril of Jerusalem, what could be creating a complication here is could they be aware of a different version of Thomas apart from the one that Cyril knows about?
I think so, and that was the point that I was making earlier too, because I think that Thomas developed. I think it was redacted into the form that we're mostly looking at today, that we have in its fullest in the Nag Hammadi collection. So there's times where I don't think that they had like 114 sayings lined up at a lot of places. They may have had certain fragments. We even have fragments today, recently discovered, that have sayings from the Gospel of Thomas. It's blended in with other of the synoptic accounts, for example. So these things they were kind of spurious in places at times. So I don't think that they were looking at the whole text that maybe we're being able to look at today through Nag Hammadi. Now, that's my personal opinion, but there's others that say, well, they probably had pretty close to what we have.
I think it's a tough one. I mean, where evidence is lacking, it's good to be humble. And I'm kind of struck both by how close the Oxyrhynchus fragments are to the Coptic and how distant they are. And yeah, you're right. There was is it P-Oxy 5575, which is this extraordinary piece where you get a little bit of what looks like some quite familiar sayings from Matthew and Luke, but then and then added to this piece where you get, if you don't sabotage the Sabbath, you won't see the kingdom, which is very clearly, from Thomas. And we have no idea what that piece is. It's this tiny little sort of fragment that only just been published a couple of years ago. And that is also something that just keeps us humble, because what I think is, well, who knows what else is in some vault in Oxford, or even more so in the ground in Egypt still, that we might discover.
Does the Coptic gospel seem to you to be going back and forth with using material from the four gospels, in a sense?
Well, for me, no. Well, yes and no. I mean, I do think that if let's talk about the work, the Gospel of Thomas, to which the different pieces are witnessing. I think that work, in whatever format it looked like to these different people, I think it was using the Synoptic Gospels. And I think the author of that work knew the Synoptics really, really well. I personally think that he had a lot of them by memory, because he has real versatility. He can, you have, if the guy was using scrolls, say, of Luke, he's scrolling from one end to the other. And I think that, instead of being the abstract, let me give you an example. In Thomas 79, we have a saying where a woman stands up in the crowd and she said, "Blessed is the womb that bore you and the breasts that gave you suck." And Jesus says, "Blessed rather is the person that hears the word of God and does it." Now, that's pretty straightforward, I think, copying of a saying that's in Luke chapter 11. But what's fascinating is that Thomas immediately goes to a saying that you also find in Luke 23, which is also about breasts and womb. It talks about, how the womb will become barren and the breasts will stop producing. And so to me, the fact that you go from Luke 11 all the way to Luke 23 in one saying in Thomas, of course it's possible that the author scrolled all the way across there, but I think he just knew it. In the same way, I'm not looking at it now. I've just recalled that from my memory. And all right, probably my memory is not exact, but I've got it roughly there, right? And I think that's really what Thomas is doing a lot of the time. So in my opinion, the Gospel of Thomas, the original work or works, was already working from the Synoptic Gospels. That then, of course, gets complicated by the fact that we have these different textual witnesses, and we have to look at those. But insofar as we can reconstruct something that we might call the earlier versions of the Gospel of Thomas, I think that author is already working with the Synoptic Gospels. At least that's the case that I've tried to make. And not everyone agrees with me. You mentioned Stephen Patterson, and he disagrees with me on this. And he's written a very, very good book called The Gospel of Thomas and Jesus that argues at some length that the Gospel of Thomas is autonomous.
Yeah, I think that you're 100% right on those two passages that are in saying 79, because I think he's quoting Luke 11, Luke 23, 29, kind of conflating those things together.
Right.
And I'm with you. It would be more like this person or this scribe would have been so familiar with the Gospels that it would have been something influenced by a liturgical presence of being around them. Sure. Probably certain types of readings, and then it is just rehashing those readings. Now, it is interesting, some of the debate on that last saying there are the breasts that have not given milk. There's some that try to point to the fact that the writer is referring back to perhaps the destruction of the temple.
Yeah.
There's a lot of interesting points there. I'm not sure if you've jumped onto that perspective, because there's differing meanings. Like, what does that even mean? Some say, well, he's probably referring to the temple.
I don't
know.
I think it's there. I think it's in the context, definitely in Luke, and I think that Thomas leans into that even more. Thomas, I think, has got to the point where I think personally it's post the Bar Kokhba war. It's like in the 130s, or possibly even slightly later, that he's worried that the house will never be rebuilt. I still think there's a hope that the temple will be rebuilt in the Synoptic Gospels. But yeah, that saying in Luke, it comes in a context where Jesus is on the way to the cross in a passion narrative that's obsessed with the temple. I mean, it's no coincidence that all three Synoptic passion narratives keep going on about the temple. And I think it's because they're written after the destruction of the temple.
Jed C4, thank you for your super chat. Could any of the sayings date back to Jesus?
Do you want to go for that, Stephen?
Yeah, it's difficult to say, and I love the approach you have to this, Dr. Goodacre, because it really goes back to we have to be careful with generalizations and then being overly specific. It seems odd to me if Thomas was independent in a lot of places, which there are independents, but it seems like it's very dependent on the four gospels. It would appear that it's not a primary source, but an agenda with the primary sources that the churches are using. Again, when you see the writer go from like Luke 11 to Luke 23 over here, this person has familiarized themselves, and I think liturgically, because some of the sayings that are here are liturgical teachings that you would learn in a church service, in a gathering somewhere. So it seems like this person was trained under those texts, and they're making a greater point or a different point, or trying to emphasize other points to its community that it learned from primary texts. Now, there are things in the Gospel of Thomas that are independent of anything we see in any of the other Gospels. So it is possible that remember, there's so many sayings and teachings that are going around about Jesus. To say that he didn't get any of them would be a little obscure, but I don't think anybody that wrote the Gospel of Thomas was like with Jesus in order to write things down, but certainly could have preserved some oral traditions of Jesus that made it through what it means.
I think, I've thought long and hard about this. I mean, my positive position is I'm sure that Thomas knows the Synoptic Gospels, but that, of course, as the questioner implies, that still doesn't settle the question. I mean, over half of the Gospel of Thomas doesn't have parallels in the Synoptics. So, are any of this? Is this author just making it up? I don't think so. I don't think the author's just making it all up. I mean, there's an extraordinary saying about the Pharisees being like dogs in the manger, which is the kind of saying that, you do get in other ancient texts. So at the very least, the author of the Gospel of Thomas is pretty capacious. He's heard a whole bunch of stuff. I mean, there are interesting analogs, some with other Nag Hammadi texts like the Gospel of Philip, but there are also little pieces that just remind you of just nuggets that you come across in Greco-Roman literature. Now, I suppose my thought is I don't rule out that some of the new sayings in the Gospel of Thomas could go back to Jesus. I tend to be skeptical because a lot of the new sayings that you find in the Gospel of Thomas are a little bit too different from the voice of Jesus that you get in the Synoptics. Now, of course, to a lot of people, that begs the question, because they'll say, okay, that's canonical bias. You're assuming that the historical Jesus is the Synoptic Jesus. Well, no, I'm not doing that. It's just that I think that the Synoptic Gospels are earlier than Thomas. And the Synoptic Gospels work plausibly as relatively early depositories of the kind of stuff that early Christians were saying. And in particular, you can just see that because they're obsessed with the kingdom of God. You've got sayings like, some of those standing here will not taste death until they see the kingdom of God coming with power. That just strikes me as something that belongs to the first, second or so generation of the Jesus movement. And then when I look at the Gospel of Thomas, to me, it looks like stuff that belongs to a slightly later generation where people have, for want of a better term, like kind of made it more mystical. It's so I tend to be skeptic. I mean, I am basically a skeptic about most of our written sources, but when it comes to the Gospel of Thomas, I want to believe, help me in my unbelief. I so wanted, and when I started working on the Gospel of Thomas, something like, oh my goodness, 20 years ago, I can't remember how long ago it is. When I started, no, way longer than that, 25, 30 years ago, I so wanted to believe that we were seeing new sayings of the historical Jesus, or new to me, because I was familiar with the Synoptics. And I'll be honest, my hope that we are finding new material there has eroded over the years. I don't rule it out, but I can't see a single saying in the Gospel of Thomas where I think that looks like historical Jesus. But that might just be my temperament. I don't know.
What do you make of Dr. Lane Pagel's argument of John rebuttaling Thomas?
I mean, I love it. I've talked a lot though. So, Stephen, do you want to go? Do you want to go for
No,
that?
no, go ahead. I'm actually going to plug my computer, and I just realized I
Okay.
didn't have it in. It's about to die.
Sure. Okay. So, I mean, this is a fun thing as well because, again, going back, so you very kindly plugged my book, Jacob, which came out in 2012. When I started the research on that book, I found Elaine Pagels's argument really persuasive. And for those that are not familiar with it, it's that in the Gospel of John, Thomas is like this key character. Thomas is absent from the Synoptics. He only appears in the list of the disciples. But then you get to John's Gospel. And in John's Gospel, every time he pipes up, it's something to do with the crucifixion and the resurrection, to the point where right at the end of John 20, which looks like it's almost the climax of the first part of the Gospel, Thomas, and the famous incident about doubting Thomas, Thomas says, I'm not going to kind of believe that the resurrection has happened unless I can put my finger into the wounds, of Jesus. And then Jesus appears and Thomas is struck by this. And he says, my Lord and my God. Now, you couldn't want for a story that is less like the Gospel of Thomas than that. The Gospel of Thomas doesn't reference the crucifixion, doesn't reference the resurrection. It doesn't think that Jesus is Lord and God, or at least it never calls him that. So to have these passages where the character of Thomas is focusing on Jesus as Lord and God through crucifixion and resurrection, it's about as anti the Gospel of Thomas as you can get. And Elaine Pagels makes this great case that maybe John is polemicizing against something like the Gospel of Thomas community. And I do still find that pretty striking as an argument. My only issue with it is that, and I want her to be right, and I still think she might be right. I tell you why I'm not convinced she's right. I can't get the timings to work, because it looks to me like Thomas dates from the late 130s, and for John's Gospel to be pushed into the middle of the 2nd century also just kind of doesn't work for me in terms of, and I don't want to go into all the details about the dating, so I just can't quite make it work on the dating. I do think there's a possibility that the Gospel of John is engaging with a kind of, like, should we call it a Thomas style Christianity? Like a kind of a, maybe there were people that already saw themselves as Thomas Christians that stressed the cross and the resurrection less. That I think I could work with. And the other possibility, of course, is you can flip it and say that the Gospel of Thomas chooses as its hero somebody who in John's Gospel is espousing a kind of a different Christology and a different theology, but it's not a particularly neat answer. I'll be honest with you. And it's one thing that, I'm very lucky. I sleep very well at night, but if I was one of these people that didn't, it's one of the things that would keep me up.
Yeah, I think it's, for me, I'm with Dr. Goodacre on the dating. I find Thomas to be later, but it doesn't mean the concepts of Thomas are later. And this is what I was saying. I believe the Gospel of Thomas was a developmental text. I think it was redacted over time. I think that it was built. I don't think it was written in 114 sayings in one setting.
Right.
I think that the communities reflect the theology that was already established before the writing. John seems to be combating different ideas that Gnostic, and I'm going to use the word when I just said not to be good, Gnostic communities, different communities held to, like the idea of all flesh being inherently evil, any physical matter through docetism, or even there's concepts where we have a little bit of information about Cerinthianism, where he seems to go after Cerinthianism at certain points. So it could be that John is responding to a similar idea. Now, I do find it interesting in John 14, verse 22, Judas not Iscariot, which I love that title, that he has to go after Judas Iscariot by even referring to him by not referring to him. It's great. He says, Lord, what has happened? What has happened? Are you going to reveal yourself to us and to the world? And so I think personally that the beginning stages here of this passage in Thomas, where he introduces himself into the prologue, I think he's connecting itself to the statements of Judas, not Iscariot, in John 14, where he talks about this hidden or the secrecy. I don't think it's John responding to Thomas. I actually think it's Thomas responding to John on the question that Judas, not Iscariot, asked Jesus in John 14. Like, are you going to reveal yourself just to us? Or are you also going to reveal yourself to everybody else? Like, are you going to give us secret knowledge, or are you giving public knowledge? And that Jesus goes into this whole idea of his commandments. I actually think that the writer of the Gospel of Thomas plays into that in his own prologue. Now, I have people that disagree with me. I've had one person say that's ridiculous to me. I was like, okay, gee, thanks. All right. But I actually think that Thomas is responding to John almost as a second. So there's an established theology. John attacks it. Thomas is not responding to the attack. Actually, that's the way it's going. What do you think, Dr. Goodacre? Is that
no, that makes sense to me. I mean, there's a parallel thing. I mean, it's so fun, like you say in John, where, I mean, John's gospel does all these great things with disciples that we basically don't know. Like, if you've only read the Synoptics, you do not know Judas, not Iscariot. In fact, there is no Judas, not Iscariot in Matthew and Mark. He only turns up in Luke's list of the disciples, apparently in place of Thaddeus. So he's a complete outlier. And then you also get in John this amazing line where Philip, who again we don't know in the Synoptics at all, he's just a name. Philip says, "Show us the Father," and Jesus says, "Have I been with you so long that you ask me, show us the Father?" And obviously he's kind of asked a stupid question, because Jesus is showing them the Father. And the thing is, and then you go and read the Gospel of Philip, and you just hear like echoes of that saying. Now, I don't think for a second that John's Gospel knows the Gospel of Philip, but there's clearly this idea that certain of the disciples of Jesus have certain, kind of reputations, as it were. And I mean, it's one of those things where I just wish we could find, and I know it's the typical request of every ancient historian, but I would just love to see more ancient texts to see what other people were saying about Judas, not Iscariot, Philip, Thomas, even Mary. I mean, like the way that Mary becomes such, and it's usually Mary Magdalene, but the Magdalene bit's frequently dropped so that she gets conflated with Mary of Bethany and even the Mary, the mother of Jesus. I mean, and she just keeps cropping up in these second century texts as well.
Yeah, I think the second century texts want to buy into questions in the Synoptics of John. So
yeah, that's right.
When you're talking about, you had mentioned Philip, he asked Jesus, show us the Father, right? Or Judas says, is this for us or the whole world? The second century texts like these really seek to answer questions in the primary canonical text. Now, they sometimes, and the reason for that, by the way, is not far-fetched, because some of the questions in the Gospels are not answered. And it's kind of like, hey, here's an open season on the question. Let's all take our perspective in it. And they take the figures. I love that you pointed that out. They take these figures like Philip, like Thomas, and all of a sudden they have a voice in John's gospel. Now they have a whole account. There's a gospel of Philip. There's a gospel of Judas. Iscariot has a gospel after him. So, I mean, when you're looking at a lot of these other texts, they now have voices and they have perspectives, but they're always seeking to answer questions that get started in the four canonical gospels. It's quite fascinating.
Well, so some people do see it as a kind of like fan fiction almost, don't they? That you've got texts that are beginning to become, they're not scripture, they're not canon, but certainly, I would imagine that the Synoptics and John are becoming pretty popular. So if you want to find an angle there, if you want to kind of find your place along with these texts, one of the ways of doing it is pick up on one of these other characters. I mean, like, pick up on one, and no one can deny it.
Here's a perfect example. Like, saying one goes with what we're talking about. Whoever finds interpretation of these sayings, right, will not experience death. Contrast that with John 8:51, where Jesus says, obeying his words is how you obtain the inability to die, immortality. It's like Thomas takes it to that secret sayings level. You got to find the interpretation. John saying, obey the commandments. Thomas is saying that's not deep enough. Like, we need to interpret it, not just obey something we don't understand. You see the back and forth. There's almost this competitive. We have the deeper meaning to obey and experience immortality.
Yeah, interpretate. Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, interpretation is the key thing in Thomas. I think the whole gospel is inviting the reader to search for the meaning of these sayings. It doesn't want you to take them at face value. It does. It almost wants you to be confused. I mean, not in a bad way. I think the Gospel of Thomas is like it's trying to spin you around so you can then go, okay, calm down a minute. Let's just take this step by step. I think it's designed to kind of discombobulate, and then you go in and say, hold on a minute, what's the thread going through here? What in a lot of the cases when you're reading the Gospel of Thomas, you find yourself in the same position as the disciples who were often foils to Jesus, where you find yourself wanting to ask stupid questions. And then you listen to Jesus' answers and you go, oh, okay. But the fun thing in Thomas is it frequently doesn't develop it. You then just go to a different saying. And then you go, hold on a minute, I haven't finished thinking about the previous one yet. You know, it is definitely a bit like a kind of roller coaster ride reading the Gospel of Thomas. I mean, any viewers that haven't actually sat down and experienced it, I encourage you to read it, because it really is the early Christian equivalent of a roller coaster ride. You are complete every time you think you know where you're going, it takes another turn.
I do have another character I want to bring up, Jacob, if you're good with that. There's another character that he introduces that I really have meditated on a long time ago, and I wrote the research on it. And then I still to this day go back and forth on how I feel about it. And that's saying 12. So they asked a question, we know you're going to leave. Whereas in John's gospel, right, they're like, you're leaving? And he's like, I'm leaving. But don't worry, I'm sending the paraclete, right? But they ask the question, like, who's our leader? If you're gone, who's leading us? And he leaves them with another name. James the righteous.
James the just. Yeah.
For whose sake heaven and earth came into being. Now I remember reading a long time ago, there's so much about what was going on here as it relates to maybe the Nicene tradition that originated, bringing in the gospel of the Hebrews. Grant and Friedman have a blast with this passage when they actually go into the discussion of this. Why do you think he is significant? Like the most random of people to show up in a gospel like this, which seems to be more in line with the Nicene tradition. All of a sudden, James the Just shows up.
But I mean, I suppose part of it, I must admit, it's another piece. I was saying earlier on that I've stared at saying 13 and I've been baffled about it over the years, but 12 as well. And the fact they're paired. But I mean, there is a very strong early Christian tradition that Judas Thomas is Jesus's brother. I mean, even Judas's twin brother in the Acts of Thomas. And he is called here Didymus Judas Thomas, Judas the twin. But I mean, here in 12, which is paired with 13, we have Jesus's brother James, who is very clearly in early Christian texts regarded as Jesus's brother. I mean, even as early as Mark's gospel, Mark chapter 6, are not his brothers here with us, James and Joseph and Judas and Simon? And by the way, there's Judas there as well. Is that the same guy? Who knows? But we've got James there, and I mean, you can go even earlier than that. The Epistle to the Galatians, Paul talks about this guy as Jesus's, the Lord's. He was called the Lord's, calls him the Lord's brother. Yeah. And whatever you make of that, certainly the Gospel of Thomas assigns real importance to the flesh, the blood relations of Jesus. And so maybe this is, witness to a slightly different trajectory of Christianity, where I mean, like, I think the Synoptics and John, to varying degrees, are critical of the family of Jesus, in spite of the fact we know they were a big deal in the early church. And maybe the Gospel of Thomas actually still has that residue of these guys are really important dudes.
And I think that just goes back to the writer was very catechized, if you would, with a lot of the church liturgical leaders, the famous teachings of Jesus, the question and answers that came through all this. I really believe that we see the characters develop through their time as we see them in the church. Because what does the last thing end with? I mean, we have this whole thing about this weird saying about the females becoming males and stuff.
Yeah.
Like we can find this kind of trajectory into even go forward into the Gospel of Mary, almost like it buys out of that concept. So these characters are coming into play in the Gospel of Thomas, similar to how we see them lay out in the New Testament and how they were seen as the pillar. Paul calls some of these pillars of the church, James probably being one of those. So these are important characters, but you sit back and you go, but why? Like, why did he bring them in right here? And it really creates a lot of questions that I wish we had more background material to explain why.
Yeah, same. But I mean, that goes back to what I was saying, that for me, so often the Gospel of Thomas is just utterly tantalizing. I think it wants to be. I mean, I know we're getting into here speculating about what the author intended, but I mean, if that author didn't intend to make us like puzzled and to be having discussions about this text over 2,000 years, what is it, 2,000? Anyway, 2,000 or so years later, then he'd failed. And I think the author succeeded because we are tantalized by it, and we do keep going back to it. I mean, every time I go back to the Gospel of Thomas, I'll be honest, I see something fresh. I'll sometimes even go and I'll say, huh, was that always there? I mean, or at least was that nuance always there? You just keep, and it's part of the clever construction that the author's done. He's trying to be enigmatic, aiming to be enigmatic because he wants to. I was going to say he wants to trip you up. That's not quite right. He certainly wants to make you keep thinking. He wants. Yeah. He thinks that the gospel is a mystery, that Jesus is a mystery, and that you have to work hard to get the inner enlightenment. I mean, I would love to have, I mean, I do sometimes wonder whether it's a text that makes the new convert so troubled and puzzled that you have to go to the leaders to get them to explicate things. But I'll promise we haven't got the key. We've only got the thing that, but who knows?
We have a super chat question from Smil Still. Thank you for your super chat. Did the Clement Gospel of Egyptians exist before 140 CE, Thomas? And what does it mean to have a fifth previous gospel, making the Thomas the sixth or so?
I want to. The Gospel of the Egyptians, known to Clement, is not the same as the Coptic Gospel of the Egyptians and Nag Hammadi. So I think we need to make. If he could clarify that for me, that would be helpful, because I don't want to conflate the two texts, because I don't think they're the same. The one that Clement is referring to is not the same one that was in Nag Hammadi.
Agreed. The Coptic Gospel of the Egyptians can't be early, in my opinion. I just don't think it can. If I could also answer the super chat in a kind of more general way, I think that. I mean, I've played with the idea myself about when it's right to talk about other gospels as being synoptic, and I recently described the fourth gospel as being in a way a synoptic gospel, because you can put it alongside Matthew, Mark, and Luke in synopsis. I would say that Thomas is synoptic in that sense as well. I mean, literally so. In my book on Thomas, I actually put Thomas alongside the synoptics and show where there are comparisons. So in that sense, it is synoptic. What I would say about many other early Christian gospels is that it's relatively rare. Gosh, I have to be careful how I say it. Generalizing statements are dangerous. I'm going to go for it anyway. It's relatively rare to see the amount of agreement with the synoptics and or John that you see in something like the Gospel of Thomas. Gospel of Thomas is very high-end amounts of agreement. That's why I would be happy with someone saying it's a 5th or a 6th or a 7th or whatever synoptic gospel. The proto-gospel of James, very high levels of agreements with Matthew 1-2 and Luke 1-2. But when you get to most other early Christian texts, the dialogue of the Savior, the Gospel of Mary, the Gospel of Philip, there are agreements there with the Synoptics and John, but they're nothing like as strong as you get in the Gospel of Thomas. So I think there is a kind of difference in kind, but obviously these are generalizing statements, and all of them can be qualified. But no, I don't personally think that the Gospel of the Egyptians was at least as referenced by Clement. I don't think that we know that it was a gospel like the Synoptics and John, but who knows?
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I would like him to kind of specify if he's conflating the Gospel of the Egyptians known to Clement as opposed to the one in Nag Hammadi, because I think the dating is going to be different there. But again, it seems to be when Clement's talking about it, I think it's in his Stromata, he talks about it. He kind of gives an example about a woman bearing children, which kind of goes with some of the synoptic teachings, but it also has some relational connections to the Gospel of Thomas in a couple of places, which I'm sure we could talk about on the whole identity of this male-female thing, because there is a teaching there that shows up at the end of saying 114, which again, I actually think probably was redacted in much, much later into the mid-second century, not much later, in the mid-second century, which springboards some of these other gospels like the Gospel of Mary. I also agree that the Gospel of Thomas seems to be utilizing the other four. I think it uses all four gospels, especially the synoptics, much more than the Gospel of Philip, much more than the Gospel of Truth or
That's
Mary.
right.
It's definitely trying to stay close to those accounts, whereas the others take more liberty.
Mm-hmm. That's right.
Here's what he said. Clement, the one with Salome, not the Coptic.
Okay. Yep. Okay. So that goes back to the earlier account. That's in the Stromata, I think, that Clement of Alexandria is quoting. It's still going to be 2nd century because it goes back to that. So here's the problem again. We're trying to identify certain thoughts and theology with documents, and we're doing our best to say, well, that group belongs to this way of thinking. But then once you think you actually finally identified something, another document comes out and you go, wait a minute, they think the same way with the nuance to it. So maybe it's not from that community after all. Half the time, I've just kind of accepted this about some of the early church fathers, and I've spent hundreds of hours studying them, is once you think you know what they're quoting and you feel like you got a grasp on it, you find out that you're not right. And there's a good chance that what they're utilizing, we're not looking at. We think we're looking at the same thing, but a lot of times we're not looking at the same thing. We've assumed that we are. And I think we have to be very, very careful when we get into that discussion.
Mm-hmm. That's fair.
When do you both think that the Thomas started to be like composed, and then by which point was it finished with the full 114 sayings?
Well, I suppose I can say the earliest point is because I think that Thomas knew and used Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and I think that Luke has to have been composed no earlier than the 90s, because I think Steve Mason's right that Luke knows Josephus. That means that the earliest that Thomas can reasonably be doing that work is in the early 2nd century. I wouldn't rule out that it's like 20, 30, 40 years of an evolving text. I mean, ancient authors did just like we do now. They had different editions. I mean, like, my recent book on John, I went through multiple drafts, So why do we think that the ancients didn't do the same? So I don't know. I think broadly speaking, I'm happy with thinking of, I don't know, 20, 30 years, but it might not have been. It might have been 2 weeks. I mean, it's very difficult to know. I mean, I think those differences that you see in the textual witnesses do make me think that the text continued to evolve even after it left its original author or authors' desks.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think that, to my mind, the earliest date would be somewhere around the 120s. And I think it was probably what we see of it in Nag Hammadi would probably be around 150, or right around that middle section. I think that 20 to 30 year gap, could it be pushed that somebody, and some argue it goes up to about 110, and some would say that some of the sayings go into the 1st century. Maybe, again, maybe there are some oral traditions that are being preserved that are much earlier, but when it was actually written, I think it's 2nd century for sure. I date it between 120, 150.
Yeah, I'm the same. I think, for what it's worth, I think Luke's gospel is relatively new on the scene. One of the things is that although the Gospel of Thomas likes Luke, there's only 4 pieces of special Luke in Thomas, which is kind of curious because Marcion's Evangelion has quite a lot of special Luke in it. And, you know, we kind of would usually date Marcion in the same kind of region. So I would actually put Marcion possibly a bit earlier than Thomas. But these are all guesses. I mean, they're educated guesses, but they're guesses.
So I think saying 114 kind of speaks to the developmental end. Like I said, there are some developmental thoughts that come into play here. Now, we know in Valentinianism, the idea of the removal of the sexes, if you would, because let's think about saying 114, because I'm sure that's a lot of people's favorite discussion, and we're all wondering what the world's going on here, right? So Simon Peter said to him, and I'll read it, let me pull it up. Let Mary leave us, for women are not worthy of life. Jesus said, I myself shall lead her in order to make her male, so that she too may become a living spirit resembling you males. For every woman who will make herself male will enter into the kingdom of heaven. Now, we assume here that the reference is to Mary Magdalene. So there's different circulating views. Like I said, Valentinianism, for example, the souls of the elect enter into the spiritual universe, the abode of God, not as bridegrooms, but as brides of the angels. So there's concepts there that go back to even possibly middle 2nd century, where the sex is completely obliterated. Now, remember, the idea is that physical matter could be understood by the writer as a evil thing, or a matter of thing that is problematic, and that true salvation comes from escape. So gaining internal knowledge, identifying truth and knowledge within secrecy is your salvific realm, to where you can escape the body. And in the escape of the body, you go back to the spiritual universe, the abode of God. Angels sent you into the universe. You go back into the elect number, and you're a part of that now, the brides of these angels. So the idea of gender is irrelevant to the ultimate salvation that comes in, say, Valentinianism or other forms of sex. So it seems like saying 114, to me, to put that in the early 2nd century doesn't really fit. Again, we got to be careful here. I said it not even 10 minutes ago. We got to be careful here. It doesn't feel like it fits the theology that we can identify into the earlier part of the 2nd century. It's more in the middle, late 2nd century. So it seems to be on its very last saying something closer to that middle of the 2nd century views that come into the obliteration of the sex or the pleroma and things like that. Seems to be more closely related to that. But I am not holding that very tight. I'm holding that very loose.
Well, there's that amazing saying in the Dialogue of the Savior about destroying the works of womanhood. And, you know, I teach a course on non-canonical gospels, and I always slightly dread us getting to that, because I know that at least half the class is going to be absolutely shocked when they see that, you know. And the making Mary male, it's always a really big sort of conversation point. Yeah. But I mean, I don't think it's a million miles away from a lot of Thomasine thought, because he is obsessed with the idea of singularity, and he is obsessed with the idea of getting back to something like the original man or woman at Eden, like several other parallel texts are. And although it's a pretty stark example of that, it is still witnessing to the idea that originally human beings were created male and female. It's a very particular reading of Genesis 1 that, you know, humankind was created male and female, and then everything went screwy in Galatians 2 and 3, you know, where Adam gets divided from Eve. And I mean, so it's not a million miles from there. I don't rule out that 114 is a subsequent addition to Thomas, but I think if it is, it's still expressing something of the Thomasian idea that the ultimate is to go back to the pre-Eden humankind that's male and female. It's like an androgynous person, an androgynous human being. The weird thing in antiquity is that they don't see androgyny quite like we do. We see it as male plus female. They tended to see it as a kind of male with female attributes. It's still, in a weird way, even though they're talking about androgyny, they still have a default male, which is kind of shocking to us.
Yeah. I think it was Ludman that stated that he thinks that this part of the Gospel Thomas was added later to kind of complement asceticism.
I think Patterson thinks that as well. I mean, there's quite this. I mean, it's, yeah, you're not alone. There's a lot of people that believe that about the end of 114, about the end of Thomas. It's certainly weird. It's certainly weird, and it's a very strange place to end a text as well.
But I really do think Valentinianism helps us understand this a little bit, because if the idea of salvation, because remember, these communities are not looking at salvation in the same way. We talked about how there's like contra to John on certain elements. If escaping the physical body, which is bound by gender, well, then that escaping of the body becomes a spirit form, an original form, because different groups within the Gnostic, and I'm going to put that in quotes here to help us all, groups, they believe the soul pre-existed the body, that angels were designated to bring those souls to body, voila, life, right? And so to escape that body in the physical matter universe that is cursed is to find salvation, which only can come through internal knowledge. So if you're able to leave the idea of the body, male, female, Jesus speaking in that way, it may be a shout out to a group like the Valentinians. We don't know. We don't know. That's what's so difficult here. It's so nuanced. But there are similarities in the middle of the 2nd century that have that concept, like Valentinianism, which is why I would not be surprised if it was.
And loads of these texts have the idea of Genesis 1, or at least the end of Genesis 1, male and female, is somehow what we want to attain our way back to again, whether that's through mystical unlearning of our like kind of physical limitations and sexual specificity, or whatever you want to call it. But no, it's great stuff. I mean, any of the viewers that are not familiar with these texts, I mean, just dive into them. They're endlessly fascinating.
I think it actually says that earlier too, and I was trying to pull it up. I think it's saying 22 gets into that oneness, the oneness idea that goes back to Genesis. I'm pretty sure it's saying 22.
I think even that, I mean, it's a while since I should have read the text before tonight, but the saying where the children stamp on their clothes, they get naked and stamp on their clothes, I think that's also a kind of hark back to Eden. Like, they're not embarrassed about nakedness anymore. You know, you're trying to get back to the original, you know, kind of the original androgynous human being, where nakedness was not anything to be ashamed of.
Yes. It takes us back to this state of innocency in these ideas. It is saying 22. When you make the two one, and when you make the inside like the outside, the outside like the inside, above like the below, the male and the female, one and the same. So the male, not male, female, male, female, male. Like, all of these things are there. Like, it does take us back to that pre-fallen state, Edenic ideas, because they have a different view of the creation narrative and how creation kind of came into being, as opposed to the Genesis account. There's some rivalry thought even on the existence of things. Where did it come from? How did it start?
Mark, do you think that also could be Thomas in its own way responding to the fleeing naked man in Mark?
Oh, I've never thought of that. I mean, I don't see why not. I mean, it's the kind of thing that the Gospel of Thomas would find striking. But the thing about the Gospel of Thomas is it's so thin on narrative. I mean, it does like allude to synoptic narratives, but just never develops them in any way at all. I mean, the Gospel of Thomas is not a great storyteller. Even when you get the parables are so condensed that they actually often are quite difficult to understand.
Yeah, look no further than the parable of the sower.
Yeah,
compared to like Luke, for example, who spends a lot of time, painting that one compared to the Gospel of Thomas. Very bland. It's like it almost kills the punch of the parable.
Right.
We got a couple of super chat questions. We'll start with Solar Knight. Thank you for your super chat. The Gospel of Jesus' wife is a modern forgery, not a genuine ancient text. How many Gospels fit the same bill except 2nd century forgery?
Well, I think there is a material difference between a modern forgery like the Gospel of Jesus' wife and something like the Gospel of Thomas. I think the Gospel of Thomas is in continuity with what you're seeing in other early Christian Gospels like the Synoptic Gospels and John. Whereas I think that what the Gospel of Jesus' wife is it's a modern attempt to dupe the Academy into thinking it's something that it's not. And I do see a difference in kind, if that makes sense. I suppose the Gospel of Jesus' wife is not the best one to bring up in the sense that it's something I spent a huge amount of time on, hours and hours, days, weeks, even back in 2012, all the way through to 2014, 15, and even beyond, because I was so persuaded that it was a forgery. I think it's different. I think it's different. I mean, obviously, it's different in the sense that that we're looking at centuries of difference. But I think, I don't know. I think the Gospel of Thomas is significantly similar to something like the Gospel of John, to make it different from something like the Gospel of Jesus' wife, which is actually a modern guy pretending that it's something from antiquity, if that makes sense.
And the intent is different because it's more nefarious.
Yeah, I think so. But maybe that's just my own. It could just be my own, I don't know, canonical bias. Well, not canonical bias in this case, but it could be my own, I don't know, ancient Christian bias, whatever you want to call it. But I'll be honest, I feel just so deeply unhappy. I mean, really, really sad about the Gospel of Jesus' wife forgery, because I think somebody spent a lot of time deliberately trying deceitfully to dupe the Academy, and including people that I'm very fond of. So I suppose I'm more personal on that. Maybe people were like that in the 2nd century about Thomas. I don't know, but somehow I see it as different in kind.
Yeah, maybe another example would be the Gospel of Barnabas, which is more medieval. I wouldn't say that it's like modern. If you hold to the forgery hypothesis of the secret Gospel of Mark, it just depends on somebody's view of that. So there's not many more. I mean, what happened with the Gospel of Jesus, I think, is a higher malicious. So we have to understand sometimes texts in the 2nd century and 3rd century were attributed to people, well, yes, kind of impersonating them, but they're actually meaning to honor them. It was more flattery than it was like, hey, I'm trying to sell you on something. Although I do think some of those texts are doing that. Like you have a letter between Peter and Philip, because Philip was not there at the ascension and Peter's writing this whole thing. I mean, the way that the writer took that letter between Peter and Philip was clearly trying to take clearly new acts in the ascension scene that was there. Philip supposedly wasn't there and really has to sell and sell and sell and sell. Thomas doesn't really do that. Thomas just mentions himself at the beginning and then just goes on and honestly honors other figures that other texts don't do that in. So I don't know if Thomas would be comparable to, say, the Gospel of Jesus' wife, maybe the secret Gospel of Mark, maybe the Gospel of Barnabas in the medieval period, but that's maybe the closest things to that one. And even that, I don't know if they're comparable.
Barry Crouch, thank you for your super chat. Since Jesus is considered to be an apocalyptic teacher, did did the Matthew create the Olivet Discourse narrative since it was written after 70 AD?
I don't know about you, Stephen. I would say only partly, because I think Matthew 24 is largely reliant on Mark 13. So what Matthew's doing there is he's copying Mark's gospel and expanding on it. And I think one of the things that Matthew does, I think Luke does it as well later, is he makes anything that alludes to the destruction of Jerusalem, destruction of the temple, he makes it even more explicit. So I think that, yeah, I think Matthew, I'll be honest with you, I don't think Matthew has substantial extra sources for that material outside of Mark. So I would actually move that whole question to Mark. Does Mark compose this post 70? I do think that it's possible that Jesus said stuff about the apocalypse, about, all these things. But the really key thing is that Mark and then Matthew and then Luke put it in their gospels, because you want the reader to go, oh my goodness, look, Jesus actually prophesied this. Oh wow, if Jesus prophesied this, look at that, isn't that amazing? So yeah, but I do think, for what it's worth, I do think Matthew's post 70. I think Luke's post 70. I think even Mark's post 70.
Yeah, so we slightly differ on dates, I guess, on some of that stuff, but it goes back to this idea that the destruction of the temple, does that always dictate the writing of a text? And this is why a lot of people start Mark's gospel, because obviously Matthew is using Mark and expanding on places. And so when there's elements of Matthew that follow Mark, Mark looks at it from the perspective of Mark 13. The destruction is imminent. It speaks in an imminent way. But we know from other writings, like say Josephus, for example, that he speaks of another guy called Jesus, who is talking about the destruction of the temple and being overtaken and all these things years before it happened too. It wouldn't be hard to predict something like that to begin with, because the scenery was being set with the tension between Rome, the Jews. I mean, you had zealots that were going around that time. They were concerned Jesus was going to have their worship taken away from them if they didn't do something with them. So for Jesus to predict the destruction of the temple, and I'm personally, I believe Jesus got it right, and say that's my bias. But even if he didn't, even if he was just taking a guess, it's not a far-fetched guess. We know from Josephus, other people were saying something like this could happen. So I've never bought into that. That means all the gospels are post 70, because they seem to know about the destruction of the temple, especially when Mark speaks of it almost like of an immediate reaction to it. Like, this is soon. This is going to happen very, very soon, which seems to be very connected to other predictions as well. But then again, that might be my Christian bias.
Well, I suppose the thing I would say with Josephus is that in a way it's similar to the Gospels. So when he has this guy also called Jesus, basically prophesying the destruction of the temple, I mean, Josephus is writing post 70, and he's included that because he wants the reader to think, oh, wow, that guy was right. I mean, if the guy was wrong, why do you include it? Josephus wants to include true prophets. And I think that's what the Gospels are doing as well. I can't demonstrate that, but I think any prophecy has more resonance if you're reading it after the events that are being prophesied. So that would be my take on it.
Yeah, I mean, we see this in the Old Testament, right? I mean,
of course, exactly.
Daniel's looking back and saying, wow, Jeremiah was right. This was,
exactly.
He said it would happen just like this. So it doesn't mean that the event wasn't true first. Somebody may have predicted something to be coming, and it took them being proved correctly for somebody to finally give them. If they didn't prove it correctly, they're either going to do it. The only time they would mention them is to ridicule them and say, yeah, look at that.
Yeah, And so the literary function of a true prophecy is that the reader is thinking, oh, wow, that's that, we see that that's happened, A bit like now, if we read something about someone that had prophesied 9/11 in the 1990s, 1980s, like that amazing, I don't know if you've seen that amazing thing, The Lone Gunman, where you actually do have planes flying into the Twin Towers, and it is pre 9/11. And one of the reasons why we find that striking is because we've witnessed 9/11, although that's probably a counterexample to me because that was pre 9/11. So ignore that for the purposes of this discussion.
We'll just use The Simpsons because The Simpsons seem to know everything before it happens. It seems like they predict everything way before it happens.
Yeah.
And what's interesting about that is that you can see people overreading into that stuff and saying that, oh, they were part of the plan, the conspiracy theories form. And I find that interesting because it's like it's trying to link everything together in a sense.
Yeah.
Now I will say the Sermon on the Mount, going back to the question, I don't want to accidentally not answer his second part. I think there, Sermon on the Mount to me is in going into the Olivet Discourse. Those two sermons are the highlighted sermons of Matthew's gospel, because as Dr. Goodacre said, they're so long. I mean, you look at Mark's version of the Olivet Discourse versus Matthew's version. We would all rather go to the sermon of Mark over Matthew. It's longer, but it seems to resonate later. I mean, if you look at some of the early texts of the church, like the Didache, for example, what is it quoting? When it seems to be familiar with the same material that's in Matthew, it's using the Sermon on the Mount and the Olivet Discourse. Some would even argue that James, the Epistle of James in the New Testament, is kind of a living, breathing example of taking those two major sermons and giving practical application to them. If you look at the Epistle of James, there's a lot of Sermon on the Mount ideas that he's putting into practice. And then all of a sudden in James 5, he goes into this weird little section of apocalyptic thought that seems to be connected with the Sermon on the Mount. And then he goes back and ends his epistle in his salutation. So it seems like the early Christian communities really latched to Matthew's version of the Sermon on the Mount, and particularly the Olivet Discourse that's in Matthew, over against Mark, which I find extremely interesting.
Mark, what do you think caused Thomas to sometimes prefer a Lucan formulation? Like, take, for instance, the blessed are the poor from Luke instead of blessed are the poor in spirit from Matthew?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think that, I mean, the easy answer is that sometimes it looks like the Gospel of Thomas is being completely random. It really looks like he's just kind of, put his hands out and then, but actually, I think the answer to it is, like any literary work, I think the author of the Gospel of Thomas is going, what suits my purposes best? And if you think about the Matthean version of that same beatitude, blessed are the poor in spirit, I don't see the Gospel of Thomas as wanting to say blessed are the poor in spirit. So I think quite often it's a simple choice like that. You see the author of the Gospel of Thomas choosing the things that fit the Thomasine theology better, and when none of them do, there'll be something added as well.
This is an interesting one as it relates to the Coptic translation, because even in the Coptic, because you think about this, blessed are the poor for yours is the kingdom of heaven. Whereas the Coptic translation of the New Testament reads there instead of yours, which is actually more connected to Matthew 5. So, and it sounds like a small, really insignificant thing, but it doesn't, because remember, if this Coptic Nag Hammadi version, if you would, of the Gospel of Thomas is utilizing the New Testament, we have to ask, is it translating the Greek Gospel of Thomas, and then is it carrying over Coptic or Greek readings of the New Testament? And I don't know your opinion on this, Dr. Goodacre. I'd love to hear it, because in one of these situations, blessed are the poor, for yours is the kingdom of heaven. Whereas the Coptic translation of the New Testament has theirs as opposed to yours. But that would take us into Matthew 5. So it's kind of interesting to think about if Thomas originally came out of Greek and was brought into Coptic, did the Coptic translators also do their own translation of the Greek New Testament, or did they look at the Coptic translation of the New Testament and bring it over? That would be an interesting discussion.
And there's another complication as well, which is many modern translations will, even of Luke, will say, "Blessed are you, Paul," and there's no "you" there. I mean, in Greek, it's "blessed the." It's the nominative case, "Blessed the Paul." And the only reason people go "blessed you" is because the second line is, "For yours is the kingdom of God." Yeah, and so you've got a whole extra can of worms there. I actually did get into that a little bit in my book about, should you translate it "blessed you, Paul," "blessed the Paul"? How does it is and then you've got the problem. You've got contrasting translations. So people will compare a translation of Coptic Thomas with a translation of Greek Luke, and they'll make conclusions that aren't valid. So no, I appreciate you bringing that up. It's a really, really fun thing, the way that the Beatitudes are done. It's one of the things I'm a big believer in, setting things out in synopsis. This is one where you really need a synopsis to sort of get them all alongside one another.
Love it.
And my final question, what do you both hope will probably be achieved later through further analysis of the Gospel of Thomas and material related to it?
I'll give you my ultimate hope is, I just hope somebody works out what's going on with the order. I'll be honest, I've spent so long thinking, what's going on with the order? Why is it like this? Sometimes it looks like a stream of consciousness. Sometimes you can see logic in this saying being paired with this saying, and this one being paired with this saying. And sometimes you can see a cluster of three and you think, oh, I can see. And then suddenly it'll take a left turn. And it's like, what's going on there? So my biggest, on my top of my wish list, is someone work out the order of the sayings in the Gospel of Thomas. But I suppose the other side of it is, I think that, and this is a criticism of me, I think that I've spent way too long looking at Thomas's parallels with the Synoptics. And what I would really like to do, and I'm actually planning a book on this, I would really like to look at the material that's unique to the Gospel of Thomas, because I think it's in that unique material that you get to hear more of the author's voice.
Yeah, that's a fair. I really do think that the independent statements that are detached would need more work. I would also like to see, now that more of the documents are coming out, especially in Nag Hammadi, most people aren't touching these. I spent about a year of my doctoral work in Nag Hammadi, and I could have gotten easily distracted from what my supervisors were wanting. So I got caught up in it and spent a whole year nerding out in it. And then it was like, okay, it's time to move on. I know you're studying second century church, but it's time to focus on the document we want you to focus on. So that would have been something that I would have loved to. And then I had kids, and then, so
believe me, I know exactly what you're talking about. Yeah.
So it's just a matter of getting into some of these very, very important sayings and breaking them down. I think the order is an interesting one too, that Dr. Goodacre mentioned, because the order, it leaves most people lost. And it makes you wonder, is like, was this text meant to be something bigger than itself? Was it meant to collect a lot of traditions? Because like I said, we see almost an evolution at times from its theology, which fits this crowd that we find in Valentinianism or Docetism. And all of a sudden it kind of has a little bit of everything. And you wonder if it's, and both of us here deny Q. So just throwing that up, but almost as if it was supposed to be something like what people think a Q was, to become a standard of the same that was going to be used for many, many traditions. I don't know, but I'd like for somebody to spend the time and think deeply about, how does it connect to this group or this development group? Or now that we have these documents over here with this congregation of the church that was condemned by Epiphanius or somebody, and say, oh, that actually fits more with what Epiphanius said this group believed, and see if it was actually meant to be a far more reaching than one single group of people's beliefs.
Mm-hmm.
Apocalypse here. Thank you for your super chat. Laura Robinson, who Mark may know, and I send you our love.
Well, that's very nice. Not just do I know her, I co-directed her doctoral dissertation. So thank you very much for that love. If anyone doesn't know Laura Robinson, just go and follow her on social media. She's full of wisdom and wit, and I strongly recommend her.
And just remind everybody real quick that the YouTube channels, the respective YouTube channels of Mark Goodacre and Stephen Boyce are tagged in the description below. It will also be in the pinned comment, and also the link to Thomas and the Gospels, the case for Thomas's familiarity with the Synoptics, will also be in the description in the pinned comment as well. That being said, Mark and Stephen, thank you both for joining me tonight.
It's a great pleasure. Thanks so much.
Enjoyed it.
Great to meet you, Stephen.
Yeah, great to meet you.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during your live stream. Thank you.